Hello, folks. Welcome back to our recorded lectures for ML103. This is Under the Raven Banner, Viking Jorvik, Part 1 of Cities of Valhalla. There are actually only going to be two parts to this. The Dublin lecture didn't quite work out. All right, so it's a bit of a lead-in. One of the most striking aspects of Assassin's Creed Valhalla is its representation of England's cities. As we'll discuss in this week's lectures, they are a mixture of fantastical and authentic. Now, it's important to remember that there are cities in Viking Age England. They are not as sizable or as powerful as they would be later in English history, obviously. But society needed centers, hubs, if you like, places where you could have a focus of administrative, governmental, religious, cultural, and economic power. Ireland's situation is a bit more complex, which is why the Dublin lecture was a bit more difficult. But the same is basically true there, even if it takes different forms. But what is tricky about Valhalla's depiction of cities is that many of their cities exist within a shell of their Roman selves, which is not accurate. I mean, yes, there were absolutely Roman ruins, and people who lived at the time would have been able to see some of them. But the Saxons would have been living on top of them, in most cases, not within them. I mean, there is a reason that archaeologists dig. Occupation layers accumulate. The earlier the period, the lower the layer. Cities are built and rebuilt on top of their older selves. The Saxons of Viking Age England were not living inside gigantic Roman ruins, but on top of them, or the remains of them. It's an interesting choice to exaggerate the presence of those ruins. I think it was the designer's way of trying to stress the different eras of the island's existence in a way, especially since looking back to the Roman period happened so frequently in game. So, for example, when you're searching out the bureaus of the hidden ones, which in contrast are usually underground, sometimes underwater. Now, the first of the cities we're going to look at today is obviously Jorvik, better known in the 21st century as York. Now, a little bit about York before the Vikings. It was founded by the Romans as Eboracum. It began as a military fortress built near the confluence of the River Ouse and the River Foss. It was originally constructed by the 9th Legion after they conquered the Brigantes people. It was named the capital of one of the two provinces of Britannia, and it served as a temporary imperial court for numerous emperors who either visited or started in Britannia, Constantine the Great being the most important of the latter type. Now, its post-Roman history is a bit murky. We're not entirely sure what went on during the period following the withdrawal of Rome from the island and the 7th century, because by then it's known as Jorvik, which is a Saxon name, and it becomes the capital of King Edwin of Northumbria. Bede, who writes his Ecclesiastical History of the English People in the 8th century, tells us that the first wooden minster church is built during Edwin's reign to mark his baptism, and then was remade in stone by his successor Oswald. Now, Jorvik is the site of a famous cathedral school, and the cathedral school is probably most famous for having produced Alcuin, who is Charlemagne's famous court scholar. Now, Northumbria, as a Saxon kingdom, was chaotic even before the invasion of the Great Army. There are a lot of reasons for this. If I had to briefly sum a couple of them up, Northumbria is a kingdom that is made up of smaller kingdoms, primarily two large kingdoms, Bernicia and Deira, which were culturally distinct from each other. So bringing them together was not the easiest thing ever, but also a number of smaller, primarily Romano-British kingdoms. So we call it Northumbria, but it's not really a unified whole. And the presence of multiple kings and all of this political chaos basically reflects that. So there are rival Northumbrian kings fighting over the throne and occasionally over the city itself. And this makes it a likely target. Not only is it in the north of the island, which makes it easier to get to for the Scandinavians, but it's weakened by its internal struggles, so it makes it a softer target as well. So what we see happen is the city is captured by the Great Army in 866 and 867. And as I mentioned, Northumbria was one of their first targets. And Ivar Haften and Uba probably just saw it as a soft target rather than, we're trying to avenge a certain snake pit incident. As we've talked about, that's mostly apocryphal. They took the city and then they advanced to fight the two kings of Northumbria at the Tyne River. This is Osbert and Ayala. Now, they actually were able to push the army back and into the city, but they were defeated there and killed. The survivors chose to make peace with the Great Army. Now, it's likely that the city was not too badly damaged in the fighting because there's no destruction layer, archaeologically speaking. Now, the sources tell us that many monasteries and churches were destroyed, and certainly some would have been, and that would have had consequences for source survival. But the debate over how much was actually lost continues. We don't know as much as we would like about the ethnic composition of the city's population under the Vikings. We do know that there are certainly plenty of Scandinavian personal names in the records and place names as well, but that doesn't necessarily tell us how many Scandinavians were settled there. It could also have been just the fashion. It's hard to say. We don't know how many of the Scandinavians who were settled there were part of the initial army, and how many came later, because the Scandinavians were in control of York for quite some time, almost 2 full centuries. There were certainly some rebellions in Northumbria against Viking rule, but there does appear to have been a Viking kingdom. How unified it was, we're not sure, but it was centralized enough to produce coinage. And there is actually a lot of coinage from Viking Jorvik. It's quite sophisticated in its design, and it does tend to emphasize the name of the king. Coinage is a form of communication on the part of an early medieval king. It's a way of legitimizing their authority. So the existence of so much surviving coinage, remember this is just a fraction of what would have existed originally, is indicative that perhaps the central authorities were stronger than we might think. Now, we do know in the 870s that Halfdan got tired of using puppet rulers and he opted for direct rule over Jorvik. And these are events that are reflected directly in the game. Eivor is involved in it. There is some discussion, however, of how much influence the Archbishop of York had over ruling the city, especially into the 10th century and the early 11th century. He seems to have acted as a sort of deputy for the king in a lot of cases. But I think the most important thing to recognize about Anglo-Scandinavian York or Jorvik is it's not really the center of anything terribly cohesive by modern standards. We think that probably rulership by the Scandinavians, and there's a situation too where the kings of Jorvik were also the kings of Dublin for a time, and Dublin, being so much richer than Jorvik, took up most of their attention. The outer boundaries of Northumbria are becoming porous and permeable and sort of fraying away. So what's happening is that Northumbria is beginning to collapse into smaller kingdoms. So the original kingdoms of Bernicia and Dira, some of the Romano-British kingdoms as well. And this has much more importance for the late 10th century when Alfred's grandson is trying to unify England as England. It's much easier to pick apart smaller states. So this is the process that happens over time. I know I sound very uncertain about what we should be thinking with regards to the government of Anglo-Scandinavian York, but it really is an obscure period. We don't have the sources we'd like to. We have stuff that seems contradictory. All we can do is acknowledge that it was probably not as straightforward as we might like it to be. Now, where things are clear is where archaeology shows us what daily life was actually like in Jorvik, and it was an incredibly wealthy city. under the Vikings. It was densely populated, and a large commercial zone was developed between the fortress and the rivers. This is Coppergate Market around the beginning of the 10th century. Um, it is reflected in the game a little bit early, obviously, but I don't know. I have to admit, when I was playing Valhalla for the first time, when I got to Jorvik, I just felt such a thrill walking out into Coppergate Market. I visited York when I was very young. I was 12, and it was one of my formative experiences of a medieval city, and I was fascinated by it. So it's always held a special place in my heart, and to see it so beautifully represented in a video game, it was just a really neat moment. So I'm a bit biased. I quite like Valhalla Jorvik, even if it bends the timeline just a little bit. Um, Certainly, Coppergate Market is established, and a sort of housing district uh, develops around it. Um, it's helped along by the reconstruction of bridges and the development of satellite systems around the harbor, satellite settlements rather, around the harbor. It's possible up to 15,000 people are living in Jorvik at this time. So, how do we know so much about Jorvik in this period? It's because of the Coppergate excavations, which began in 1976. This is the first wave of excavations, 76 to 81. It produced over 40,000 individual objects, something like 250,000 pottery shards, 5 tons of animal bones, and it's the source for most of our original knowledge about everyday life in Jorvik. It shows us that Jorvik was importing a dizzying variety of goods from elsewhere, not just in the British Isles, from the continent, from as far away as the Red Sea, the Baltic, and there are goods from Central Asia that show up in the Coppergate excavations. There are things from Samarkand, for instance. Now, Coppergate and other sites in York also show us a wide variety of trades and crafts being practiced right there in Jorvik. A specialty in leather crafting in particular, and metalworking of all sorts. Now, we also know that the Vikings restored the walls, or rather rebuilt the walls. Eboracum obviously had its own walls, but they were decaying and probably had been basically stripped mined for their stone on numerous occasions. This is one of the better depictions in the game, the walls being under constant reconstruction. Now, many other sites are actually being excavated in addition to Coppergate these days. What they've done so far has just scratched the surface. For instance, they're taking a close look at the middens, and this gives us great info for the diet of the people of Jorvik. We know they ate beef, pork, venison, horse meat, wildfowl, geese, 35 different kinds of fish, including some brought in from the North Sea. So, why were the Coppergate excavations in particular so productive? And it's because they're in a low-lying area of the city near the rivers, and these archaeological layers were waterlogged, and because of the water, stuff was preserved that would otherwise not have survived. I mean, there are numerous habitation layers, and the total thickness in some cases was up to 5 meters. Now, as part of the Coppergate excavations, the York Archaeological Trust created something called the Jorvik Viking Center. And so this is actually situated in Coppergate underneath the modern shopping center. I have been here. It is quite amazing. And they actually rebuilt a section of the Coppergate neighborhood on the original site underground. As visitors, you ride in basically an automatic car that goes through the scene, or the several scenes. It's a reconstructed neighborhood. You even have a little bit of the harbor there. And it is peopled by animatronic Vikings. Please don't, I know I'm laughing. Please don't laugh too hard. They're actually quite good these days. I've been to Jorvik Viking Center twice. Once was in 1988, once was in 2018. And the 21st century animatronic Vikings are much more convincing than the ones back in the 80s. They're just basically people going about their everyday life. And the whole scene is stocked with replicas of the objects that were found. Like, it's perfect in every detail to what they think life in Coppergate would have looked like. They even reproduce sounds and scents, and the scents are kind of creepy at times. Like the smell is horrible. I'm just going to be blunt about that. Is a tremendously popular tourist site because it gives your average visitor a visual representation of what the archaeological work has found. And as I said, it's been rebuilt and improved several times. There was flooding, and they had to rebuild a big chunk of it at one point, I think in the late 90s, something like that. Now, when you get off the ride, you exit into a museum gallery with a number of the original objects in it. So you have the replica and you have the originals there to take a look at as well. And probably the most important thing about the Jorvik Viking Center is that it brings in a lot of money. And where do you think the money goes? Straight back into excavating Jorvik. So it is a very good example of public-facing archaeology serving the needs of academic archaeology as well. And, I'm looking forward, if we ever manage to get our field course back on the way after the pandemic's over, to going back to York and seeing it again. All right. So last little bit to close us out about Valhalla's Jorvik. Obviously, it's not a perfectly faithful replica. Size alone would dictate that, if nothing else. The exaggeration of the Roman elements is quite significant. The amphitheater in particular is a big issue. We don't know for sure if York actually did have an amphitheater. It makes sense that Eboracum, as a major legionary base, would have had one because other legionary bases did. But it's not been found. And actually, back in 2017, there was a protracted search for it as part of the Eboracum Roman Festival. There was one particularly promising site that had a sort of suggestive depression where the modern buildings were kind of tilted inwards a little bit. I wasn't able to find out what they concluded regarding the site itself, but it obviously wasn't a successful discovery of the amphitheater, or it would have been splashed all over the internet. I mentioned that the walls were very authentically portrayed, however. They're in a state of disrepair, they're being rebuilt. You have Roman portions versus newer portions. There are a few very authentic spots represented, however. The Multangular Tower, for instance, is present in the games version of the city. And the Multangular Tower is a piece of fortification that was originally the western corner of the Roman fort, built around 300 CE. And since then, it's been rebuilt and added on too. So it's got portions from many different periods. Currently, you can see it. It's in the Yorkshire Museum's gardens. It's quite striking, actually. But it shows up in one of its earlier forms in Valhalla's Jorvik. You have a minster as well. And one of the coolest things about York, and one of the things that made it basically my favorite place to visit in England, is York Minster. And the current day York Minster is a Gothic cathedral. It is one of the biggest in Northern Europe. It is absolutely stunning. Like, seriously, just Google it, ogle the pictures. It's one of the most beautiful churches in the world. But there have been churches on that site, possibly since the Roman period. So the Viking Age is a very obscure period for the Minster. We know, as I said, that there was a stone structure there. It was built in the early 7th century. We're told that St. Wilfrid of York rebuilt it in 670, but then it was destroyed in a fire in 741, then rebuilt on a more grand scale. And at that point, its historical record becomes murky, and we don't really know what was done to it until the 11th century, when we know it was repaired by the first Norman archbishop. Now, if you visit York Minster today, well, first of all, make sure that you get one of their local guides, because they're absolutely awesome. We had this genteel old man when we were there the last time, and he knew everything about the cathedral. He had stories just about every little nook and cranny and every tiny feature of it. But he talked about, there being multiple churches sort of resting on top of each other. If you go down underneath the church to what's known as the Undercroft, This is it was improved, rebuilt, the actual exhibit halls and so forth in 2012. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get into the Undercroft when we were there in 2018. I remember being let down into the crypt in 1988 when I was there, and it was a special case. People didn't usually get to go down into the crypt, and I recall seeing the remains of the Roman building sort of glassed over. This was the site of the original legionary barracks. So what they did was when they excavated the original Undercroft, they found the bases of the pillars and so forth, and you can view them down there. And they've made more of the archaeology down there since then. So for instance, some of the work leading up to the reconstruction in 2012 found coins, and coins that identified a mint near the minster in the early 9th century. So basically during our target period. And the mint is actually represented in game as covered in more detail in the Discovery Tour. So Valhallas Jorvik is not accurate. It's not. It is authentic in a lot of ways you wouldn't expect it to be. It certainly draws on Viking Jorvik for inspiration, represents some things semi-faithfully, other things not particularly. It is probably one of the best laid out areas in the game, though. Like, you can just wander around Jorvik and, hit up little world events and explore buildings and so forth. It's quite remarkable, actually. Like, you can literally go down by the harbor and have a drinking contest at like an ale hall. It's amazing, and I find I forgive its inaccuracies just for its immersiveness. So the game's done quite a remarkable job with it, or the designers have rather. And I would say that Jorvik was definitely one of my favorite parts of the game. All right, so that should do us for this particular lecture. I will be back with a follow-up on London. Thanks very much, guys.